She fired me on a Wednesday. 20 years of loyalty, erased in 12 minutes. No handshake, no severance. Just a tight-lipped smile from the boss's daughter and a folder marked transition plan. I handed her my access badge, my keys, and every password to the company's internal systems. Finance, operations, vendor networks, server logs, all of it, neatly printed. No fuss. Then I walked out of the building and never looked back. 3 days later, the company collapsed. My name is Robert Hale. I'm 56 years old. For 2 decades, I was the IT director at Artnix Medical Systems, a mid-sized healthcare technology firm based out of Indianapolis. We weren't flashy, but we were vital. We handled records processing, software integration, data migration for over 100 clinics across the Midwest. When I started in 2004, we were a team of 14, working out of a converted dentist's office. By the time I left, we had 112 employees, 5 regional hubs, and a national contract pending. I built the entire infrastructure from scratch, designed the network, coded the first version of our internal system, wrote the protocols. Every alert system, every backup routine, every failsafe, it all had my fingerprints on it. But none of that mattered once Amanda took over. Amanda Wells, fresh MBA from Northwestern, 30 years old, daughter of the founder, Charles Wells, a man I respected more than most. He was sharp, decisive, and knew when to let his people lead. When Charles had his stroke last year, Amanda was brought in as interim CEO. Most of us assumed it was temporary. She didn't know the systems, didn't know the people. But she played the part well. Sharp suits, buzzwords, smiles and meetings. Always just polished enough to pass. 2 weeks before she fired me, she introduced her fiancé, Daniel Rhodes, as a consultant. Said he'd be shadowing key personnel. I knew what that meant. By Monday, Daniel was sitting in on my team's sprint reviews, asking vague questions about architecture. By Tuesday, I caught him copying credentials from a shared drive I told him not to touch. By Wednesday, I was called into Amanda's office. She said my legacy systems were holding the company back, that they needed someone with a modern perspective. Said Daniel would be stepping into a hybrid leadership role. I didn't argue. I nodded once. Said I understood. I printed every password, every instruction, every shutdown sequence. Then I handed her the envelope and walked out. The cameras caught me leaving. No dramatics. No words. Just a quiet man walking away with his spine intact. Amanda thought I'd just given up everything. What she didn't know was that systems are only as strong as their logic. And when the logic is broken, the system breaks itself. People like Amanda never notice the man behind the curtain. They see the interface, the tools, the dashboards, and think that's where the power lives. But real systems aren't about what's visible. They're about what's buried under the surface. And for 20 years, I buried everything exactly where I wanted it. I didn't need to sabotage anything. I didn't need to change passwords or corrupt files. Because I built it all with dependencies. Dependencies she didn't understand. Little things, automated scripts that needed manual tokens every 72 hours, encrypted backups with single-use keys, backend APIs that checked time-based authentication routines only I could reset. None of this was hidden. It was just documented differently. The manuals I gave them were clean, simplified, corporate-ready. Enough to make it seem like the transition was seamless. Enough to keep them from asking questions until the system stopped behaving the way they expected. That's the thing about technology. It doesn't punish you immediately. It waits. I knew what they'd try to do first, streamline. Rip out legacy code, as they'd call it. Daniel would probably deactivate half the monitoring tools, thinking they were unnecessary. Amanda would disable backup verification scripts, believing them redundant. By the second day, I guess they'd try to deploy from their clone staging server. What they wouldn't know was that it required a certificate rotation from my terminal, something we only did manually to avoid injection risks. If they pushed anyway, it would trigger a loop in the security sandbox. Not a breach, just confusion. Silent. Expensive. By day 3, the phone would start ringing. Clinics unable to access records. Reports stuck in processing. Encryption flags on standard files. A gradual crawl toward shutdown, not because someone hacked them, but because the foundation had been pulled from under their feet. I didn't do any of it after she fired me. I'd built it in years ago. Because when you run the backbone of a company for 2 decades, you don't just protect it from outsiders. You protect it from itself. Charles understood that. That's why he gave me full control, admin privileges without oversight. Because trust wasn't just personal. It was procedural. Amanda never earned that trust. She just inherited the seat and thought the power came with it. What she never realized is this. Access isn't control. Understanding is. And Daniel? He was playing with tools built by someone 10 times smarter than he was. They thought they'd replaced a relic. What they really did was unplug the brain from the body. And now, the body was about to seize. On the 4th day, the alerts started showing up. I wasn't monitoring them directly. That would have been reckless. But I still had access to an old vendor dashboard, one they'd forgotten I helped build. The webhook logs weren't scrubbed when they offboarded me. That morning, I saw the pattern. 3 identical requests hitting the API within milliseconds. Then a timeout. Then another batch, thousands of duplicate calls, each one choking the bandwidth. It wasn't a cyber attack. It was their own system cannibalizing itself. They were trying to force sync data across their regional clinics. Probably Daniel's idea. Something about automating the legacy sync process. What he didn't know was that the sync wasn't just code, it was protocol. Every transmission required a multi-factor handshake, coordinated through our old internal token server, which, by design, was no longer active. No tokens, no sync, just endless loops, eating bandwidth, corrupting transaction chains. By noon, they had a full system lockout. I got a call from Morgan. She used to be our lead finance analyst before she moved to another firm. She didn't know I'd been fired. Said she'd received 3 different invoices from Artnix that morning, each one misdated, all for the same vendor. Her tone wasn't angry. It was concerned. Robert, what's happening over there? I told her I didn't know. And I didn't. Because this wasn't sabotage. This was gravity. Pulling down a structure that wasn't built to stand without support. Amanda and Daniel likely scrambled. Called the hosting provider. Checked firewall settings. Blamed the dev team. Maybe even suspected malware. But they wouldn't find anything. There was nothing to find. Just misfired logic. Flawed assumptions. And an infrastructure they never took time to understand. I imagine Amanda tried to call me. She didn't have my number anymore. I'd changed it 2 days after she fired me. Out of reach. Out of obligation. I sat in my kitchen that evening with a cup of black coffee, watching the sunset turn the trees gold. In the distance, I imagined the office lights flickering, servers humming under pressure, staff staring into screens that no longer responded. They had all the power. They just didn't know how to use it. I'd warned Charles once, years ago, about building systems so efficient, they'd fall apart the moment the wrong person touched them. He said that was the point. We build them strong enough to survive storms, but not fools. He wasn't wrong. By Friday, their central billing database was offline. Their clinic partners were panicking. Their internal ticketing system was frozen. The damage wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, precise, and completely their own. By Monday morning, panic had fully set in. From what I could piece together through whispers and contacts still inside, Amanda had locked herself in her office. Staff said she looked pale. Not angry, not furious, just lost. Like someone who finally realized the safety net had a hole. Daniel, on the other hand, tried to play the part of the fixer. He called emergency meetings, demanded logs, asked the IT team to roll back updates and recover backups from cloud storage. What he didn't understand was that those backups required manual decryption keys. Keys that were time-sensitive and rotated every 48 hours. The last rotation? 2 days before I was fired. The keys had already expired. No one regenerated them because no one knew how. Not Amanda. Not Daniel. Not even the junior devs he'd tried to impress during his onboarding tour. They followed protocol like a checklist, but they didn't understand it. And now, protocol was biting back. The few employees who still believed in Amanda's leadership were quiet now. Not because they were loyal, but because they were watching her unravel. They saw her pacing hallways, holding strategy meetings with lawyers instead of engineers. The way she avoided eye contact. How she repeated phrases like temporary glitch and just a delay. The rest? They started whispering my name. They remembered how updates ran on time, how systems ran smooth, how I handled issues before they ever reached anyone's desk. I never raised my voice, never demanded attention. I just solved things. And now that I was gone, things weren't getting solved. They were breaking. In silence. One by one. That week, I had lunch with Peter Tran, our former DevOps manager who'd left 6 months before Amanda took over. We sat at a small cafe on the edge of town. Neutral ground. He didn't ask questions, didn't pry, just said, "They didn't realize what you built until it stopped working." I didn't answer. I didn't have to. He nodded like that silence was the answer. The clinic clients started pulling out on Thursday. First the smaller ones, then the regional chains. Most of them cited instability. One email even mentioned gross negligence in data integrity protocols. Amanda tried to stop the bleeding by promising a system reboot. Said they'd modernize, outsource, move to cloud-native solutions. But nobody trusted her anymore. You can't rebrand your way out of collapse, especially not when the collapse is internal. By Friday, 3 employees walked out, and I hadn't touched a single file. No hacks, no sabotage, just the absence of what they fired. That's the part no one prepares for. Not what happens when you break something, but what happens when you remove the one person who kept it from breaking in the first place. By the end of the second week, Artnix Medical Systems had become a ghost ship. Vendors froze accounts. Partner clinics filed breach of contract claims. The company website showed a vague, undergoing maintenance banner. And Amanda? She started calling old managers. People she once dismissed without blinking. People like Peter, like Lacey from compliance. Even Grant, the finance lead who warned her not to consolidate IT authority under Daniel. None of them responded. Not out of spite. Out of clarity. Amanda wasn't calling to fix anything. She was calling because she knew the collapse had already started. And the only person who could stop it was the one she fired without a second thought. Me. She didn't have my new number. Didn't have my address. Didn't have access to the off-grid repository where I archived old system docs. Because that drive was never connected to the network. It was updated manually, by me, every quarter. Stored in a physical vault. Old school. Secure. Unreachable. By Thursday, I got an email from a former Artnix vendor rep. Subject line: "Everything okay over there?" I didn't reply, because nothing was okay over there. And everything was finally clear over here. Amanda had made her final play that week. Hired a consulting firm, Outsiders. Big-name people with shiny slide decks and generic solutions. They promised a system rebuild in 4 weeks. What they didn't know? There was no system to rebuild. Because Artnix didn't own their infrastructure. It was custom licensed under Charles's old model. Built to be proprietary, decentralized, and reliant on full-cycle, closed-loop configurations, secured through a trust-based credential chain. My chain. No shortcuts. No workarounds. And with every passing day, more dependencies timed out. More internal processes hit dead ends. More digital limbs went limp. Daniel tried to hold the team together. I heard he even started hosting town halls to reassure staff. Promised everyone bonuses. Called the outage a temporary hiccup. But the devs knew better. The project leads? They stopped showing up. No one wanted to be the last name on a sinking ship's roster. That Friday, Amanda made one final move, public. A statement was posted to LinkedIn. Leadership transition underway. Strategic realignment in progress. Grateful for our team's resilience. Corporate language for, we're imploding, but smiling through it. I read it once. Saved a screenshot. Then closed the tab. Because that's what closure looks like in my world. Not a confrontation. Not a headline. Just a quiet screen. With nothing left behind worth watching. The week Artnix went completely dark. No one said a word publicly. No press release. No statement. No apology. Just a digital disappearance. The website went offline. Emails bounced. The office phones rang to an empty auto attendant. It was like the entire company had never existed. I wasn't surprised. Amanda never understood that silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes, it's the final phase of collapse. The consulting firm pulled out after 6 days. Rumor was they couldn't access even half of the archived systems. They reportedly called the infrastructure hostile, which made me laugh, not because I built it that way, but because they'd finally said the quiet part out loud. They weren't in control. No one was. Not since I left. That's the thing about ownership. It's not about contracts or job titles. It's about comprehension. And without it, you're just clicking buttons, hoping the machine doesn't bite back. Amanda stopped trying after that. Her LinkedIn account went private. Daniel's profile disappeared. The last image of them together, posted the day I was fired, was quietly deleted. But screenshots remember. So do people. I received one final message that week. It was from a burner address, anonymous, encrypted, vague. One line. You win. I didn't respond. Because I wasn't playing a game. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity. And now I had it. My systems were never designed to hurt anyone. They were built to protect against outages, breaches, carelessness. But when those safeguards were discarded, they did what they were programmed to do. Shut down in silence. Not with flames. With stillness. I opened a secure folder on my personal drive that night. Inside were backups of everything I'd ever built for Artnix. Code, documentation, architecture plans. Not stolen. Just copies. Insurance. Legacy. Proof. I erased the folder. Not because I feared a lawsuit. Because I was done carrying their weight. I also deleted the vendor access panel I'd kept just in case. Closed the tunnel. Wiped the token history. Took myself offline. Completely. Sometimes the most powerful move isn't burning bridges. It's walking away like they never existed. The next morning, I made breakfast in silence. No alerts. No calls. No fallout. I opened my front door to sunlight and a crisp wind that smelled like late fall. And in that quiet, I felt it. Completion. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Just the clean, unmistakable feeling that nothing more needed to be said. Nothing more needed to be done. They fired me without warning. I left without noise. Now, the silence belonged to me. 2 weeks after Ardenix collapsed, I received a letter. Not an email. A real envelope. Thick paper. Handwritten return address. No company name. Just a name I hadn't seen in a long time. Edward Langford. He was the CTO of MedSecure Systems, a direct competitor to Ardenix. We'd crossed paths a decade ago at a security conference. I remembered him as sharp, even-tempered, always listening more than he spoke. His letter wasn't long. He said he'd followed the Ardenix unraveling quietly, watched how the systems failed without an attack, how the logs revealed no breach, just internal entropy. It fascinated him. Then he wrote a single sentence that stood out. You didn't crash the system. You removed the gravity holding it in place. He invited me to meet. Not for a job, for a partnership. Said he wanted someone who understood systems not as code, but as ecosystems. Someone who knew that trust isn't stored in servers, it's stored in silence. I didn't answer right away. I spent a week thinking. Not because I had doubts, because after years of being the man behind the curtain, I'd grown used to the stillness. I wasn't sure I wanted to re-enter someone else's machine, even if the operator respected its architecture. But eventually, I responded. One line. I'll come. I won't stay if it feels loud. We met at a private office outside Chicago. No logos. No suits. Just a clean room, 3 chairs, and a server rack humming softly in the corner. He didn't ask about Amanda. Didn't mention Daniel. Didn't need to. He spoke about legacy systems, about fail-safes, about redundancy without fragility. He asked if I believed peace could be engineered. I told him it could, if you're willing to build for it, and not for applause. We shook hands. I left with no contract. No job title. Just clarity. It wasn't about rebuilding my career. It was about proving that quiet doesn't mean invisible. It means deliberate. At home that night, I opened an old hard drive. Inside were dozens of projects I'd built over the years. Tools, routines, forgotten side projects. One stood out, an AI-based system checker I'd started but never finished. I reopened the code. Not for work. For myself. Because sometimes, after you've walked away from the noise, the only thing left is to build something that doesn't need to be understood. Just respected. By the right people. And if not, then it doesn't get released. That's the beauty of silence. You decide what speaks and what doesn't. I didn't return to corporate. I didn't need to. Instead, I did what I always do when something breaks. I rebuild. But this time, it wasn't for someone else's company. It wasn't for a CEO or a board or a budget committee. It was for me. It started with a single line of code. Then another. By the end of the week, I had over 10,000 lines. Clean. Structured. Silent. I called it Sentinel. A private system, part diagnostics, part watchdog, part preemptive failure architecture. Something I'd been sketching in notebooks for years. It didn't just detect system anomalies. It predicted them, taught itself patterns, corrected logic before it failed. There was no dashboard. No flashy UI. Just function. I kept it offline. Local only. Like a weapon in a glass case. Only to be touched when absolutely necessary. Langford didn't ask for progress reports. He understood the work was the proof. He sent me one check, half the agreed sum up front. I didn't ask for the second. If it came, it came. If not, the code would live with me. I wasn't building it for sale. I was building it for control. That's what no one understood at Ardenix. They thought control meant ownership. But real control is understanding. That's what Amanda never had, and what Daniel never even tried to grasp. As I built, I started sleeping better. My body felt looser, like I'd finally let go of a burden I'd carried for 20 years, being the invisible pillar. The one who stayed late, fixed things before they broke, smiled when others got the credit. I didn't want credit anymore. I wanted clarity and quiet. The irony? People started calling again. Old clients, friends of friends, former vendors who'd heard I was consulting independently. They asked for help. Not flashy things, just order. Stability. They didn't want me in their meetings. They wanted me in their systems. Invisible. Untouchable. Effective. I picked two. Strict vetting. No nonsense. Both were veteran-run medical startups with integrity and backbone. We kept things simple. Monthly check-ins. Zero PR. No boards. Just results. I worked from home. From silence. From a position no one could take from me. One afternoon, while running a security routine on Sentinel, I saw something strange. A ping from an old address. Ardenix's root domain, still technically active. No files. No website. Just a heartbeat packet. An echo. The last flicker of a dead machine. I didn't touch it. Didn't trace it. I just watched it fade. Because some ghosts don't need exorcising. They just need to be left in the dark long enough to disappear. And me? I was done watching the past. The future had already begun compiling. The ping didn't come back the next day. But something else did. An email. No subject line. No signature. No sender info beyond a throwaway domain. Just one sentence. If you'd warned me, I might have listened. I read it once. Then twice. There was no attachment. No demand. Just the digital whisper. A final breath from someone who finally realized the depth of what they'd never understood. Amanda. I didn't need to guess. No one else would have written that. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a trap. It was grief. The kind that arrives late, after the noise dies, when all that's left is silence and the faint scent of ashes. She hadn't reached out before. Not after the collapse. Not after the system crashes. Not when Ardenix's name was quietly removed from clinic contracts and replaced by others more stable. She waited until the dust had settled. Until she had nothing left to defend. But I didn't respond. Not because I hated her. Because there was nothing left to say. I didn't need her regret. And she didn't need my forgiveness. Some people only learn through consequence. And some systems are only understood in failure. That's how I built Ardenix. Quietly, deliberately, layer upon layer of logic designed not to punish, but to require attention. The moment attention faded, the architecture folded in on itself. It wasn't a curse. It was physics. And Amanda? She was a tourist in a world she never studied. I archived the message. Didn't delete it. Just moved it into a folder called Echo. Not to revisit. Just to remember. Because every system has echoes. Residual pings from past users, old processes, faded triggers. You don't chase them. You document them. You track the patterns. Then you move forward. That night, I walked the perimeter of my home. Simple routine. Something I'd done for years. No threats. No signs of anything wrong. Just cool air, rustling leaves, and the silence of someone who no longer needed to look over his shoulder. I paused near the mailbox. Looked out at the empty road. And for a moment, I thought about what would have happened if Amanda had asked for help instead of asserting control. If she'd listened. If Daniel had kept his arrogance in check. If I'd been treated like more than a replaceable part. Then I let the thought go. Because if they had treated me differently, none of this would have happened. And maybe I never would have walked away. Sometimes, the system has to fail so the architect can finally rebuild, on his terms, without noise, without shadows. There was no final confrontation. No courtroom drama. No press conference. The fall of Ardenix wasn't loud. It was clinical. Just a slow, steady disintegration until the name meant nothing. A placeholder on a defunct server. And me? I kept building. Not for profit. Not for legacy. For precision. Sentinel evolved. It learned patterns faster. Anticipated failures before they emerged. I gave it one rule. Detect threats, but never draw attention. Protect without revealing. I didn't need applause. I needed stability. Sometimes I'd get quiet requests from firms I'd never heard of. Invitations. Proposals. Some were subtle. Others offered more money than I'd ever earned at Artnix. I ignored most of them because I wasn't building for anyone else, just for the system, the kind that doesn't need recognition to hold the world together. My days became simple. Wake early. Work until the logic flows flat. Walk the perimeter. No meetings. No politics. Just a clean interface between me and the machine. Peace isn't silence. It's the absence of disruption. I live there now. I thought about Charles from time to time. He'd seen something in me back then that no one else had. Not just a technician, not just a systems guy, but an architect. One who understood that every function, every failure wasn't random. It was a reflection of intent, or the absence of it. Charles built for trust. Amanda built for power. One of them succeeded. The other disappeared. One night, I archived the final logs from the Artnix collapse. They'd expired from vendor repositories, but I kept personal snapshots. Not for revenge, for reference. Like a failed experiment whose notes still matter. I encrypted them, then stored the drive in a fireproof box and slid it into the back of my safe. Not to protect it, to bury it. That's how legacies end. Not with noise, with quiet precision. At the end of that week, I updated Sentinel with a new directive, one I hadn't added before. Just 4 words. Do not replace me. Not because I feared being forgotten. Because some systems are not meant to be replicated. They're meant to be singular. Built once. Correctly. That's the difference between coders and architects. Coders solve problems. Architects prevent them from existing. I shut the laptop, stepped outside, and in the still wind, under a quiet sky, I understood something I hadn't until that moment. Some men fight loud. Others, they engineer the storm before it arrives and walk away before anyone knows it was them. That's not vengeance. That's discipline. And in that discipline, I finally found what Artnix never gave me. Peace. Been through it. When they crossed a line, and you made sure they felt it.